Hello there, and welcome to today's episode of the Easy EdTech Podcast. My name is Monica Burns, and I am so glad that you're here to join me today. If you want to make the most of education technology, aka EdTech, well, you are in the right place. My goal has always been to help make EdTech easier and give you ideas you can try yourself, share with a colleague, or bookmark for later in the school year. Every Tuesday here on the Easy EdTech Podcast, you'll hear stories from my time in the classroom, the work I do now with schools and districts, and my travels to different EdTech events. Get ready for solo episodes where I share some quick tips and stories, and interviews full of practical ideas and stories from new guests each month. If we mention something you'd like to check out, make sure to click the link. You'll find it in the episode description or the summary area where you're listening to this podcast, or you can find every episode and all of the resources we mention by going to classtechtips.com/podcast, or by going to classtechtips.com and just clicking on the Easy EdTech Podcast button at the top of the page. This episode is sponsored by EverFi. Do you want to equip your students for success in both their careers and personal lives, but find yourself racing against the clock? EverFi is your go-to solution. Their digital lessons align with state standards and the prestigious ISTE seal. These lessons are crafted to empower your students to excel in our dynamic world. Engage and inspire with interactive, self-paced lessons meticulously designed by content experts. From financial literacy and workforce readiness to character building, health and wellness, these lessons are tailored for students across all grade levels. Best of all, thanks to EverFi's generous partners, these research-based resources come at no cost to all K-12 schools, districts, and students. Visit everfi.com/Monica. That's everfi.com/Monica to get started today for free. This week's episode is all about podcasts. 8 creative ways to use podcasts with students. And if you use educational podcasts in your classroom, have been thinking about using podcasts, well, this is the perfect episode for you. We know that quick video clips, like the ones you might find on YouTube, are pretty popular. They're often shared in classroom settings. They can help a teacher kick off a new lesson, give kids background on a topic, or even introduce students really of any age to a new concept. Videos, super popular, of course, but podcasts are becoming increasingly popular both inside and outside of the classroom. It's a great medium for sharing information, interviews, and stories. And educational podcasts can help teachers introduce students to a world of ideas, to narratives or stories, and expert insights, all by giving them a link or a file to listen to. So today on the podcast, we're going to look at some favorite ways you can use educational podcasts to create interactive learning experiences for your students. And I'll give a shout out to a few favorites that I think are worthy of your attention, and I'll link out to those also. I'm recording this for you in the beginning of August. It'll go live in the end of August. And just last month, I was spending some time with educators in upstate New York, and we were talking about curating resources for students. I say last month, but it was like literally 2 weeks ago, probably at this point. So not terribly long ago. It comes up often in my conversations when talking with educators as a way to move beyond a blog post or video that we might be more familiar or used to sharing with kids to a medium that they will interact with in lots of ways, which is audio, particularly podcasts. So what exactly is a podcast? Well, you're listening to one right now, right? So a podcast is essentially a digital audio show which you can stream or download for listening. Now, I will play a podcast while I'm emptying the dishwasher or folding laundry, and I often think of the radio playing in my house growing up. We were a big like radio in the background people. And even today, as an adult, I find myself with a podcast playing kind of like the radio, more likely to be in the background than a television show. I mean, taking the Olympics out of the equation, that is, which has been running on repeat during this beginning of August as I'm recording today's episode. So podcasts, well, sometimes they're in a series with new episodes, right, on a regular cadence or around a particular theme. My Easy Ed Tech podcast has new episodes every Tuesday, and it's a schedule I've kept for more than 5 years now, which is kind of wild to think. Some podcasts, they're more like narrative, where there's like a first and a last episode. These ones typically just have a handful of episodes, and they really have a beginning, middle, and an end. One of my favorite examples of this is Dolly Parton's America, which has a narrative format. It's like telling a story. I'm not big on like true crime or narrative podcasts generally, although I love the Dolly Parton one. I tend to listen to podcasts more like mine, actually, which maybe have a current events or like a what's new feel, or have some information I could use whenever I listen to it. So plenty of ways to use podcasts. And of course, if you're listening to this podcast, you are already a consumer, right, of this medium, whether it's just mine that you listen to, or if you have a handful in your podcast queue. So whether you're working with kindergartners or supporting high school students this year, there are lots of ways to use podcasts to make interactive, engaging learning experiences happen. So I'm going to go through a handful of ideas for you. I'm going to do my double check count. I think I have 8 for you. Yep, that's right. I've got 8 for you today. And we'll go into some ways, or these 8 ways you can use them for interactive learning experiences. So first on the list is to supplement course content. If you're teaching a topic and know students or their families might want to dive deeper, you can supplement your course content and traditional resources with podcast suggestions. Maybe you pop this into a newsletter for families with some supplemental resources, or you make a list attached to a QR code and you let students scan and pick a podcast they might download or check out a little bit later. The next creative way is to introduce storytelling podcasts. I mentioned a adult-friendly one, the Dolly Parton one earlier, but a great way to introduce a narrative structure for student writers is through storytelling podcasts. Circle Round is one example of a podcast that's full of start to finish stories. It even has complimentary coloring book pages on its website. Circle Round is totally free. Kids can stream it from their website. So it's a nice option for both online and offline listening experiences. Another creative way to use podcasts is to spark debates. Many podcasts, especially those that focus on current events, include guest speakers who have different perspectives, even different perspectives than the host of the podcast. And after listening to an episode or a clip together, kids might take part in a similar type of debate and model the structure of the episode. Of course, this might work better with different content or in different subject areas, but it may be something that inspires you to get kids talking about a topic. Next up, number 4 is news updates. Many news organizations, including Axios and the New York Times, have podcasts that go live each morning with news updates. And even though you might not play them each morning for kids, they might help you get some info that can help make connections to current events with the content you are teaching. So that one is kind of a twofer, right? You might recommend it or play a short clip from one, or you might just find it helps give you some information you can use that day. Next up is a read aloud spin. And although I love the great video resources like Storyline Online for read alouds, you might want to explore an audio only option. I love the Tony box, TONIE box. You might have seen that. My niece is obsessed with it. I buy her the little figurines all the time. It's like a screen-free, audio-only storytelling experience. And although that's a really great tool, it's a favorite. I've done some work with them in the past on the blog to share their work. You might find a similar experience with a podcast and have kids interact with it the same way they might interact with a read aloud story. So a great way to take a spin on audiobooks or to introduce kids to the concept of audiobooks, but just in smaller bites. Another way to creatively bring podcasts into the work you do with students is through a podcast club. If your kids show an interest in listening to podcasts, you might start a podcast club for them as an extracurricular activity. Students can come to a meeting with a podcast suggestion or recommendation and bring that to their classmates or talk about what they like or they don't like about the production or quality of a podcast they regularly listen to. So a great way to build community and get kids talking through this type of medium. An extension of this, or number 7 on our list, is to have kids share a favorite. This could be a spin on a persuasive writing activity or the way kids might recommend a book to one another. By having them share a favorite, they can take what they've listened to, formulate kind of that this is why type of hook to go along with their recommendation. And of course, you can infuse a whole range of your speaking and listening or writing skills related to persuasive writing. Now, finally, the last one on our list of creative ways to use podcasts with students is by having them create a podcast. As kids listen to podcasts, they might come up with a few ideas of their own. And the more comfortable they become as they're consuming this type of content, well, it can really set them up for success as content creators. They listen to a podcast and then they have ideas of how they might do it just like or even better than the person whose podcast they're listening to. So there's lots of tools that could come in handy here. You might use Soundtrap for education. You might use GarageBand. I've been a fan of Adobe Podcast this year, another free tool. If you've been with me and done some work around creativity in the classroom, you might have seen me kind of talk about that one or show off how fun it is and how easy it is to use. I think I showed it at ISTE this year actually too. So just another option. And today, in this episode, we looked at a handful of ways, creative ways to use podcasts, and we're just scratching the surface of what's possible. You might find a podcast in a foreign language that you're sharing with kids to practice their listening skills as they learn a new language. You might interview a subject matter expert in audio format and share it with kids like a podcast. So many ways to make this idea your own in your classrooms. So let's make this EdTech easy with a few key points from today's episode. Use podcasts for interactive learning in lessons and debates. Engage with storytelling, news, and read aloud podcasts. Start a club for students who share their favorite podcasts and talk about something they listen to together. Inspire content creation with tools like Soundtrap or maybe even GarageBand. Remember, you can find the show notes and the full list of resources from today's episode by heading to classtechtips.com/podcast and looking for number 282. And if you are following me already on Instagram and you're ever in need of a resource or you can't find that thing I mentioned on a particular episode, just send me a note on Instagram, send me a DM. You can find me at Class Tech Tips. A big thank you to Everfi, our sponsor for this episode. These research-based resources come at no cost to all K-12 schools, districts, and students. Visit everfi.com/Monica. That's everfi.com/Monica to get started today for free. Thank you for listening to this new episode of the Easy EdTech podcast. I love creating new episodes for you each week, but I could use a bit of help spreading the word about the podcast. Can you leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app? Spotify will let you tap on the stars, and Apple Podcasts will let you tap on the stars and leave a 1 or 2 sentence review. Thank you so much for taking this extra step. It helps other educators find episodes like this one when they're searching for EdTech tips.